it continues to increase as time goes on. Another way to picture financial inequality is to look at the distribution of wealth, the economic assets that people own, their savings, bank accounts, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and real estate. Basically anything you own that's not your income. That's the other side of it. At $97 trillion, the total of American wealth is huge. So let's watch a video to demonstrate the inequality of wealth here in the States.
Saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution, shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
That kind of just reminded me of something that has nothing to do with the lecture, but I hear a lot of people say, you know, election's coming up, I don't care, like, I don't know enough about it, I genuinely don't care. It's like, how do you not care about this kind of stuff? Like, you know, who wants to live? I don't know. It's very interesting to me. Okay, so now let's talk about wealth and power, because power goes hand in hand with wealth. If wealth is good, then what's the problem, right? Part of the problem is that the 1% of Americans who own 42% of the nation's wealth wield immense power over the U.S. economy. As this elite group pursues even more wealth, they move production to Mexico, India, or China where labor is cheaper. So what happens to jobs when we move production to cheaper countries? Lose our American jobs. Who does that affect? The wealthy or the poor? They throw hundreds of thousands of people out of work, and when they close factories in the U.S., they throw out hundreds of thousands of people out of work when they close factories in the U.S., but this is not their concern. To them, this is merely a side effect of seizing economic opportunities. It is the wealthy who make these decisions, but it is the U.S. workers who must live with the consequences of this global game of monopoly. The wealthy live in a cocoon of privilege. They enjoy luxurious homes and safe neighborhoods. They are protected from unemployment, injustice in the courts, and unresponsive political systems, right? All of those are the systematic opportunities for inequality that regular everyday people experience. The wealthy are sometimes immune to that. And we've seen that, right, in cases where people break the law and they get a slap on the hand, but everyday people are sentenced really long, harsh sentences for things that are just to perpetuate their advantages, they send their children to private schools, hire top financial advisors, attorneys, and lobbyists. At the other end of the money spectrum are those who cope with deprivation as a part of their everyday life. So what is the impact of poverty? What difference does poverty make? On the most obvious level, the poor can't afford new cars, fine restaurants, and prestigious private schools. But beneath this obvious level lies a world of deprivation that enshrouds the lives of the poor. Families who save and finally purchase homes at times become victims of predatory bankers. They charge them higher interest, even those with good credit. When times get tough, the higher monthly payments make it more likely that the poor will lose their homes. And if they try to negotiate lower monthly payments so they can hold on to their homes, they're unlikely to meet sympathy. Because our schools are supported by property taxes, the poverty in poorer areas produces less tax revenue. And the schools that the poor attend with are schools poor attend have less money to work with. So this translates into outdated textbooks, inexperienced teachers who are paid less, and overall lower test scores. Lower test scores affect students' chances of going to college, which in turn affects their earnings. If children from poverty go to college, most attend community colleges where they can take vocational programs or receive financial aid. In contrast, most children from middle class and wealthy homes attend state universities or even elite private colleges. So you see, poverty has an impact from the very beginning all the way to the end of the lifespan. Jobs and careers also follow this educational path. Children of the middle and upper classes secure high-paying professions and other positions. To children from homes of poverty, the term career is a foreign word. And again, this isn't to say that one person can't go and achieve something different. This is just saying generally speaking. Not only do the poor not know if there will be enough money to buy food, pay rent, but they also need to cope with the frustrating bureaucracies of unemployment insurance, welfare, and other social programs. I don't know if any of you have ever gone through that, but I have, and it's not fun, it's a pain. So it makes people's lives that are already hard even harder. The poor are more likely to be victims of violent crimes and to commit robberies and assaults. Crimes for which offenders are punished severely. When the poor are arrested, they lack the resources to hire good lawyers to defend themselves. Often they can't post bail, and they remain in jail for months while they await trial. Most prisoners in our jails and prisons are people who were reared or brought up in poverty. Now let's move along to the theoretical perspectives and see what they have to say about these issues. To understand the relativity of poverty, I'm going to read through some scenarios on page 188 of the text. These are just okay, so first, wait, let me make sure. Okay, here we go. So the relativity of poverty. Andy, Sharon, and their 2 children live in a small house in a rural area where they farm 65 acres. To make ends meet, Andy works part-time at a local grocery store, and Sharon works part-time as a cook at the Dew Drop-In. Between the jobs of the farm, they make about $18,000 a year. They grow their own vegetables, raise a few chickens for eggs and meat, and fish in the nearby pond. Andy brings home a deer each hunting season. Integrated into the community and with their basic needs satisfied, they don't think of themselves as poor, and neither do their friends and family. Leslie attends a private college. Her parents pay her tuition, fees, books, rent, utilities, medical insurance, transportation, and entertainment. They also give her about $500 a month for extras. Unlike many of her friends, Leslie has no car, and she complains about how hard it is to get by. Her more affluent friends feel sorry for her. Between auditions, Keith, a struggling young actor, works as a leader. He earns about $1,400 a month, which has to cover his rent, food, and all other expenses. To make ends meet, he rooms with 3 other aspiring actors. It's difficult to make it, he says, but one day you'll see my name in lights. Keith sees himself as struggling but not poor. Nor do his actor friends think of him or themselves as poor. Maria and her 2 children live in a housing project. Her rent is subsidized and cheap, $97 a month. Her welfare, Medicaid, and food stamps total $16,287 a year, all tax-free. Her 2 children attend school during the day, and she takes classes in English at a neighborhood church. Maria considers herself poor, and so do the government and her neighbors. So our book also says, we have an irony here. Leslie is by far much better off financially than the other 3, yet she feels poor. So why is that? Again, it goes back to relative poverty and us kind of, like comparing ourselves with others.
And relative to her friends, she is struggling to get by.
Yeah, she has less, she doesn't have a car, and all that. Yeah, and then somebody else might be like, let me do that, let me have my parents pay for all that, right? So that's just another example of the relativity of, you know, symbolic interactionism says we make meaning, we give meaning to what it means to be poor, and that's why it's so difficult, because one person might think you're poor and another might not, and when you're trying to get help, that makes it hard. If there's no clear, or if they say you're not really poor, and you're like, okay, but I am, you know? Okay. Symbolic interactionists stress that to understand poverty, we must focus on what it means to people. When people evaluate where they are in life, they compare themselves to others. In some rural areas, simple marginal living is the norm. And people living in these circumstances don't feel poor, right? We have people living off the land, just like we did back in the day, and life's good. They don't have anything to complain about. But using Leslie as an example, in her little circle, in her cosmopolitan circle, people feel deprived if they can't afford the same as the person next to them. So again, the meaning of poverty is relative. What poverty is differs from group to group, even within the same society. Its meaning also changes from culture to culture and from one era to the next. How people above the poverty line view poverty is also significant. If they see the poor as good people who are down on their luck, they're more likely to offer a helping hand by supporting programs that provide job training and monthly support. If they view the poor as lazy no-goods who refuse to work, a parasitic drain on society, then they're not likely to favor such social policies. That's really, really, really important, right? Because, again, looking at that video, you can't tell me that all of those people are lazy and don't want to work. That's just, you know, it's just crazy. That's like any area where you lock everybody in, right? All these people are this, all these people are that. The world's not black and white. Symbolic interactionists stress that the meaning of poverty changes as social conditions change. The way people viewed poverty in the early 1700s was remarkably different than how we view it today. At that time, religion really played like a greater role in society. So at that time, poverty was seen kind of like as God's will, right? This is what's meant to be, this is to humble me, and this is what kind of help us. Poverty wasn't seen as a social problem. It was more so a personal problem, right? This is my circumstance. Later, during the American Revolution, the poor were seen as deserving it due to flawed character. So at one point in time, we had that attitude, right, of, well, if you're poor, it's because you're lazy, or it's because you don't want to do better, right? So that started to be a thing. Then as the U.S. developed, poverty was seen as being due to corrupt cities and becoming a social problem. So just like I said, over time, as things have happened through society, our meaning and opinion of poverty has changed as well. So what does functionalism say? Why is it so far down? Can poverty be functional for society? Or is poverty only dysfunctional? Because remember, functionalism looks at what works, what doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. Some positions in society are more important than others for social. Some positions in society are more important than others for society's welfare. To attract highly talented people, these positions must offer high income and prestige. To learn the technology and aspects of certain jobs can take years of training. To motivate people to postpone gratification and continue studying for years, positions must be offered a substantial salary and high respect from others. So that's what functionalism says about some jobs, right? Every job can't be the same, because then why would people want to do the hard jobs? They would just go for the easy jobs. So it makes sense to an extent. There has to be some type of competitiveness when it comes to jobs and pay and all that. On the other hand, anyone can wash dishes, so these unskilled workers with little training can be given low pay, right? We wouldn't start giving out high pay if everybody could do that job. Differences in income and prestige sort people by their abilities and their drive to succeed, and this helps society function. Functionalists tend to see the function in everything. Although functionalists analyze the dysfunction of poverty, including alienation, despair, drug abuse, street crime, suicide, and mental illness, they point out that poverty is functional for society. So again, from a functionalist point of view, it works because we can't all make it, right? There has to be some level of stratification because even the smallest jobs matter, right? And those janitorial jobs or those dishwasher jobs matter. So they may say, yeah, poverty sucks for you that are living in poverty, but for the society as a whole, it works, right? So that's kind of what they're saying. The book also points out 12 main functions of poverty. So, according to the book, this says, the poor ensures that society's work gets done at low cost. Okay, that makes sense, right? Street sweeping, emptying trashes, cleaning up the restaurants, yada, yada. The poor create jobs for others, right? So now as we have social services and now we're making all these programs, now we need people to work those programs to serve the poor. The poor serve as guinea pigs in medical experiments. So throughout history, that's been true. The poor make the economy more efficient. The poor provide an income for others, even making some wealthy. The poor provide the frontline soldiers for war. The poor help stabilize our political system. The poor provide entertainment. The poor enrich our music. The poor help motivate us. The poor help our self-concept, and the poor provide support.
Is that the function of it, or?
According to our book, those are some of the functions of poverty. So like I said, they may say, yeah, it sucks, but it works. That's how some people do it. And then we have good old conflict theory. That's like, we're gonna shake things up a little bit, right? So central to conflict theory is the idea that a society's resources are limited, and that groups compete for these resources. So in each society, some group has gained control of that society's resources. This group uses those resources to make a better life for itself, to keep itself in power, and to exploit weaker groups. The result is a social class system in which the wealthy pass advantages to their children, while the poor pass disadvantages to theirs. So if you remember looking at that chart, that kind of makes sense. Karl Marx was the first person to develop a general theory of social class. He argued that social class revolves around a single factor, the means of production, or the tools, factory, land, and capital used to produce wealth. So if you have something that, can produce wealth for you, then you're good. You're of a high social class. People are either capitalists or the bourgeoisie who own the means of production, or they are workers, aka the proletariat, who serve the capitalists. Okay, so that's a bunch of big words. So what does that mean? So it means some people are the workers, and some people are the owners. To put it in simpler terms.
You either work or you volunteer.
Right. You either own the company or the company owns you, right? Or something like that. So the history of society is the history of conflict between owners and workers, the wealthy and the poor, right? Because when industrialization happened, that's kind of what started to happen. We all went from being on equal footing, right? We're all struggling to get by, farming, making our own food. But then now as we start to have these factory jobs, again, we start to see those social classes divide. Because not everybody can be an owner. If everybody was an owner, who would work? Not everybody can be a worker, because if that was the case, then who's owning the system and making it work? So that's where that all started. Because the owners hold the power, they manipulate society's social institutions, economic, legal, political, educational, and even religious, to promote their own interests and to control workers. According to Marx, the day of reckoning will come when workers shrug off their false class consciousness, I'll explain what that means in a minute, the delusion that they will start their own business and become wealthy, right? So that's the American dream. We all say, if we work hard enough, we're going to get there. We'll make it. But according to Marx, he's saying that one day we're gonna realize, okay, it's not me right here. That's not gonna happen, right? And he says in its place will arise class consciousness or the realization that whether we are garbage collectors or college professors, we are all workers, right? We all have a boss somewhere. There's always a head honcho that makes more money than us. So that's kind of what Marx is saying. Conflict theory just revolves around the working class, and that's what makes people rich or makes people poor. We also have feminist theorists, because remember, feminism is like a subcomponent of conflict theory. And they point out that Marx analyzed the exploitation of workers in the paid sector, but that he overlooked the unpaid sector, where women perform reproductive and household labor, right? Because the conflict theory can occur in the home too. It's not just people that are working for home. There's also women who work in the home, and you see, at times, you see that power dynamic at the home. Not so much now, it's just, right? We're leaning more towards equality. But that's what feminist theorists say about Marx's ideas.
Is that why they make, more kids and more everything, you know, they need to have their company continue at times?
Yeah,
Sometimes.
that's why there is a push for population growth in the country,
Yeah.
because we have a shrinking or non-existent working force that's going to be taking over for older people.
And we have a chapter coming up on that.
Oh,
Yeah, so definitely. But think about it this way though.
I've
We
had
can afford to have kids.
I've had discussions with
Yeah.
people, like after slavery ended, the owners lost their free labor. And
Right.
ever since then, they've been trying to implement things to get back cheap labor.
And then now but also look at minorities. Now we're having less children. I can't just say minorities because I'm not sure about, non-minorities. But we're having less children for many, many reasons, but like cost of living, women are working, all these other things. So like you were saying, where's the free labor now that we're not having 6, 7, 8 kids? Yeah, so that's a little bit about that. Now, what does research say? And I promise we're getting close to the end. It's a little bit of a longer chapter. I think it's 2 chapters in one, possibly, I don't remember, but research findings. So who are the poor in America? According to our book, they're the people who work at a minimum wage job and are trapped in poverty. They clean motel rooms, they clean motel rooms, they have unskilled jobs, low education, worse nutrition, and more sickness than others. And if they change jobs, it is likely for more minimum wage work, right? You don't really break that cycle unless you have some type of skill or something that allows you to go for a better job. For most of these people who refer to as the underclass, poverty will remain their lot in life. And geographical location also plays a big role in poverty and jobs as well. So remember how we were saying earlier, if you live in a small rural area and there's not enough jobs and that's where you live, you will see those higher unemployment rates. Research also shows that children and the elderly live in poverty. Can anybody guess why?
They don't work.
Because they don't work, right?
Too young to work, too old to work.
Exactly. Poverty is also related to age. The poverty rate of the elderly is lower than the national average, but the poverty rate of children is higher. Poverty in the United States is concentrated among women and children. Sociologists call this pattern the feminization of poverty. Children who live with both parents are seldom poor, and children who live with just one parent are often poor. And it is usually the mother who heads single-parent families. African Americans and Native Americans are about twice as likely as Asian Americans and whites to be poor. If their poverty rates, as well as those of Latinos, could be reduced to the rate of whites or of Asian Americans, many of people would no longer live in poverty. So to learn more about homelessness, I'm also going to read from the book on page 196. So being homeless in the land of the American dream. And this is something written by the author. When I met Larry Rice, who ran a shelter for the homeless in St. Louis, Missouri, he said that as a sociologist, I should learn firsthand what is happening on our city streets. I was reluctant to leave my comfortable home and office, but Larry baited a hook and lured me onto the streets. He offered to take me to Washington DC, where he promised that I would see people sleeping on sidewalk grates within view of the White House. Has anybody actually been to DC? I can tell you that's 100% true. You'll see homeless people sleeping in front of the White House. And that's just like an oxymoron of our country, right? Yeah, so intrigued at this contrast painted in my mind, I agreed to go with him, not knowing that it would change my life. When we arrived in Washington, it was bitter cold. It was December, and I saw what Larry had promised. Sorrowful people huddled over the exhaust grates of federal buildings. Not all of the homeless survived the first night I was there. Freddie, who walked on crutches and had become a fixture in Georgetown, froze to death as he sought refuge from the cold in the telephone. I vividly recall looking at the telephone booth where Freddie's frozen body was found, still upright, wrapped in a tattered piece of canvas. I went to Freddie's funeral and talked with his friends. To me, Freddie became a person, an individual, not just a faceless, nameless figure, shrouded in city